But what happened in Europe is that you are short energy in the most literal sense. In the most physical sense, you are short energy. And it's my read at this point that governments and companies see something that they can't even get their heads around, and they can't engage in the market at this price. They don't know what to do. They don't understand what they're seeing. It breaks every possible norm that any economist or market regulator or politician is ever used to seeing. And they're just paralyzed. And the public has no idea. They think that this is sort of like that inflation that's sort of been happening, or things are going to get a little more expensive. They don't know what's coming.
Let's start with the sort of most present issues in Germany. You just told me that you got off the plane flying to Europe just recently, and you went out the plane watching the electricity price going bananas in Europe. What's your take on the current issues in Europe, first of all?
Energy costs more than Europeans are currently worth to themselves. That's a very dangerous thing to say. I don't say that thinking, haha, you silly people messed up your energy policy. If anything, we just got lucky in America having so much fossil fuels to get us out of our own particular bind. But what happened in Europe is that you are short energy in the most literal sense. In the most physical sense, you are short energy. And it's my read at this point that governments and companies see something that they can't even get their heads around, and they can't engage in the market at this price. They don't know what to do. They don't understand what they're seeing. It breaks every possible norm that any economist or market regulator or politician is ever used to seeing. And they're just paralyzed. And the public has no idea. They think that this is sort of like that inflation that's sort of been happening, or things are going to get a little more expensive. They don't know what's coming. And it just was reemphasized when I get off the plane, and lots of people are talking about different things. They're glad to be home. I was in the line with the Americans and British people are all in the same line. And just, I was looking around, looking at the price on my phone of electricity contracts going up, 700 euros a megawatt hour for baseload 2023 in France. Or in Germany, 800 euros for the same thing in France. And I'm just looking at these, and life shuts down at that cost. You just can't run an economy at that cost. Now, of course, that's just the sharp edge. That's the next marginal unit being bought or sold in this crazy market. That's not the whole volume, but it's absolutely clear that the politicians are paralyzed and the public has no idea what's coming.
Yeah, I perfectly agree with that assessment. By the way, I had an opinion letter in a Danish newspaper this weekend saying the exact same thing, that no one's talking about how grave this situation is. But if we look at the forward pricing of electricity and natural gas into the winter in Europe, it is even priced to increase compared to current spot levels when we look at the contracts in December 2022 and January next year. Is it your assessment that the scarcity of energy is worsening by the minute right now?
At this point, what does scarcity mean? What would it mean to run out compared to not running out at the current prices? Just to give a weird little example for electricity in the United States. So my family's from Oklahoma. Oklahoma's just north of Texas. They don't connect very much in electricity, and they have different electricity markets. In the famous February 2021 blackouts in Texas, there was just massive failure to deliver energy. There's something like a quarter below expected demand in the ability to deliver power, with millions of people out of power. In Oklahoma, there was some power outages in a number of places, but they kept enough electricity on, traded at near the market cap, that they are going to be paying off billions for like 2 decades. So is that better or worse? At what point do you just have to not have energy because there's a financial collapse at paying for it at the price that is being offered on the shredded remains of the market? Sorry, that wasn't a complete answer to your question, but it's just, at this point, scarcity, running out, these words stop being meaningful in terms that we've seen before. Perhaps this is why we're not hearing people talk about it. To even talk about it is to sound like a blathering Chicken Little. Oh, we're all going to die. It's so high, it breaks every possible norm that to even bring it up is to show you almost certainly don't have any way to make it better, or maybe almost no way to make it better. We'll get to that. And what are you going to offer people? Better to just ride through, straight through. And if it doesn't turn out to be a crisis somehow, at this point, it's hard to see it not being a really mortal crisis, then you don't look dumb having brought it up and sounded like a chicken little. And if you can't do anything about it, that sounds even more weak and powerless. So maybe that explains the lack of discussion, the paralysis that we're seeing.
Do you think we should expect blackouts in Europe this winter?
It's really difficult. So first of all, blackout is a word that can cover a number of different things. I was recently on the BBC to talk a little bit about something that's a form of blackout, you can say. It feels like a blackout for those it happens to, and that's load shedding. That's when the grid operator knows that they won't be able to meet demand. They expect not to be able to do it, and they have a tiered system for who gets cut off of power at what time based on the expected deficiency, and then any surprises that come up, positive or negative, they'll adjust from there. So load shedding is when you might think of it as when you've planned badly over a long period of time and you know it going into a tough night, a tough day, a tough week. And blackouts, we typically use that in public discourse to mean a sudden accidental loss of power from some extreme event, maybe, or maybe damage to aspects of the grid that deliver power, or damage to specific power plants, maybe. Where load shedding is just a general lack of enough energy that then has to be assigned to different parties at different times. And so to answer your question, I expect that we will have some load shedding. And here's another thing, though. I expect that a great deal of future damage is going to be done to minimize the load shedding and especially minimize the blackouts. That is, we're going to eat the seed corn. We are going to eat the stalk of seed that was supposed to grow next year's harvest and the year after that. And that will help get us through this winter better than we deserve based on how much energy we found for the continent.
Makes a whole lot of sense, that point. If we look at the underlying reasons why Europe has ended up in this situation, what's your assessment of the sort of political backdrop leading to this crisis in Europe?
At this point, the whiplash narrative from COVID disruption is pretty well known. And I assume that you've probably talked about it, and it's covered in a lot of different forums where you had a drop in demand compared to expected. That led to low prices from oversupply, and then an increase in demand suddenly that could not be accommodated by either, you might say, the long-term secular trend of lower investment in fuel-based energies, shall we say, fuel-based. We can expand that later, but in just trying to explain how I see this crisis, it's that there's clearly only room for a certain difference between supply and demand. In electricity, very tiny. You physically, moment to moment, there's no difference. You have to exactly match. Doing that over a longer period of time is a slightly different thing, but is connected to the same problem. In gas, clearly, there's a little bit more room to have difference in supply and demand over a day, week, month. By the time you get difference in supply and demand over a season, that's more than the seasonal rhythms of the gas storage and withdrawal and burning seasons that are already there. When you get a little bit more burn or a little bit of a deficit in how much you're supposed to fill, you start seeing these pretty wild price swings. Coal is a little bit more stable, it seems. And the reason I feel that makes sense is because it's chunky, it's easy you can store it in a big pile. So its physical attributes make it a little bit easier to handle. Why did I mention all those different fuels? Because in the end, the ability to cope with demand changes, moment to moment, day to day, week to week, season to season, year to year, comes from having the option to turn up the burners, to turn up the plants, to turn up the gas pipelines, to turn up the nuclear reactors if you plan far enough ahead. But we'll get to that one. And I just don't think that planning occurred. And I think that there was this thing where long tail events in, say, energy models for whole nations we're covered by, I'm sure we'll be able to get exports from somebody, or we'll just pay a little more at the edge of our model. But when everybody's model links up together like some, like the devil's jigsaw puzzle, and everyone expects to be the one whose long tail event is covered by leaning a little bit more on others, doesn't add up. And it didn't add up together as a whole continent. There are other little weird things in that story that we could focus on. I don't know if the detail is worth it here, but during a fairly critical period last year, not only did it turn out that Russia was not sending gas supplies that normally they would have and normally would have been expected, but there was an unusually high price starting to gather because there was just a huge wind drought. Now, over the course of the year, the wind recovered a bit towards the winter, and the winter was a little bit more mild, but during a fairly key period of last year, there was just really still winds across all of Europe pretty much at the same time. Those little things are going to start mattering more and more as Europe I don't know if they're going to continue, we'll see, but if Europe continues to base its energy supply in bulk on weather patterns, well, I don't know if you've heard about this climate change people are talking about, but you can't really base your energy supply, which is there partly to respond and to smooth out the harshness of nature, to smooth out the weather, right? Both the weather as it affects farming and harvesting, or the weather as it affects transportation or demand, that's tricky enough. When you're making the weather have to fuel you at the base level, boy, I just don't think even if we can handle it maybe in some places, or eventually we might be able to, people, societies, leaders, we're not ready for having both supply and demand be strongly affected by the weather. That's the way I read the current crisis.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.